The Waveform View is where we can work visually with our audio files. So depending on how many channels our audio file has, we'll see individual tracks for each audio channel. So we have a 2-channel file here, single channel, we get a nice view of the entire waveform, and then a 5-channel file, we have individual tracks. So BaseHead will support up to 10 audio channels, and we'll see an individual track for each channel. Now we can resize this area if we need to, just above the timeline here, we can click and drag and resize the area. If we wanted to work with individual tracks with a multi-track file, we can go to the left here, hover over the drag and drop bar, and then we have channel extract buttons at the top here. These correspond to the channels that we've got within our file. Selecting these will individually show that single track, and we can now switch between them by just clicking the next track button here, or we can use the keys on the keyboard, so numbers 1 through to 0. We'll select the individual tracks. We also have this mono sum button as well. So clicking this mono will merge all tracks into a single mono file. Now we can revert back to the original file just by pressing escape. Now if we move our mouse over the waveform and use the roller wheel, we can zoom the amplitude of the waveform. We can also do this automatically when selecting a file by going into the options, so the little gear icon here, and then selecting the option auto gain waveform. Now by default, if we click and drag over the waveform, we get a purple region selector. This will highlight a selection and zoom in. We can then jump back through the zoom by hitting the Z key, or we can jump out all the way by hitting the A key. Now we can also select a region of our file to work with by holding down Shift and dragging. We get a yellow selection marker where we can adjust the start and the end points by clicking and dragging the handles. Or we can grab the entire section in the timeline bar and reposition it on the waveform. Now, if we want to disable the default behavior of click and zoom on the waveform, we can go into the options and select the option disable waveform zoom. When we click and drag, this will now select a region which we can now work with. Clicking within the waveform will trigger playback from the location, and then the spacebar will play and pause playback. Now if we highlight a section, it starts playing that section automatically, and it will continue looping if we have the loop playback option selected up here. If we select a marker, it will trigger playback from the location of the marker. If we select a region or a loop marker, it will trigger playback, and it will also highlight that section. So a region will stop automatically at the end, whereas a loop will continue to loop around. Now, like in this case, if we have a lot of markers and these are getting in the way of what we're trying to do, we can disable the marker view by going into the options and hiding markers. This simply hides markers. It doesn't remove them from the metadata, just simply hides them. Now we can also insert what's called a sync marker. So a sync marker is inserted by holding down Alt and then clicking. Now sync marker is used in programs such as Nuendo, Cubase, Pro Tools to set a synchronization point when we import it onto our timeline. So the audio file will be synchronized at the synchronization point automatically when the file is imported. Now this one is saved along with markers. So all of our markers up here are saved into the metadata. When we create a sync marker, it is automatically saved into the metadata of the file. If I click away and go back, we see that the sync marker is still there. Now I can remove this by just simply going up to the pin and using the X to delete. Now if we hold down Shift and click, this will set what's called a trigger point. Now a trigger point isn't saved within the file. This is only temporary. If we reselect the file, the trigger point disappears. The trigger point is used to set a re-trigger point when we use the play pause, the spacebar. So when we re-trigger playback, it triggers from the trigger point. Now another marker you might see is the start and end markers. So these appear if there is silence detected by BaseHead automatically at the start and at the end of files. This is where playback will be automatically triggered from when we select the file. So you'll see when I select this file, playback is triggered from the start marker automatically. It skips over the silence. If you use the escape key to force trigger playback, it will always start at the very start of the file. If we wanted to disable the detection of silence, we can go into the options here and deselect the option skip silence. The start and end markers will now not appear. Now, when we're working with our waveform and we want to start exporting audio, we can simply export what we see by pressing S if we're using a DAW with spot to track feature. So press S and it sends the entire audio file straight to the position in our timeline. We can also highlight a portion of our wave file. So if we highlight a portion here, when we click S, this will send just that portion to our timeline. Now, if we're using a DAW that doesn't support the direct spot to track function, we can use what's called the drag and drop bar to the left. So the drag and drop bar over here, when we click and drag that, whatever selection we've got, if no selection is made, it drags the entire file. This will automatically take the file and we can then drop it onto our timeline. So if we've got a selection made, it drops the selection. Now, to make this a bit quicker, if we're using selection mode here, we can actually put the mouse in the top part of the selection, click from here, and it will trigger the same drag and drop. So we don't have to go all the way over to the drag and drop bar if we're using a selection. All right, so we're just running over some of the extra options that we've got here. So if we click on the gear button over here, the options button, we have actions that are listed here. These are all pretty much just menu actions for shortcuts we already do with the keyboard. Just a few to run over here. First, the reverse file option here. If we press Control R, that will actually make a reverse copy of the file that we're working with. So when we play it back, it actually still plays back from the start here, but the whole file has actually been reversed. We also have these options up here. Rebuild waveform, F5. This will just force BaseHead to redraw the waveform. So for whatever reason we need to re-trigger the rebuild of that waveform, we can just hit F5. Build all waveforms will trigger BaseHead to work through whatever is displayed in our results list and build the waveform file for each file. Now, the waveform that's drawn on screen is actually saved to a separate file. This just makes it quicker when we're selecting files. We don't have to wait for BaseHead to draw the waveform before we can start using it. Now, when we import new files into BaseHead, they don't have a waveform file yet. So when we click on the files, the waveform is actually drawn as we click. So we can trigger the option to build all waveforms, and this will force BaseHead to work through each of the files that's displayed and build that waveform file. Now, the cache file that's generated for the waveform is saved within a subfolder within your library. But we can set the cache location to just a local drive if we wanted to. So if we have the option to cache locally, this can be quite handy if you're using remote files where the directories aren't writable. We can cache the waveforms locally. We just enable this cache locally option and select which drive we want to store the cache files on. Now, if we want to disable waveform caching completely, we can disable the use waveform caching option. And now the waveforms will be drawn when we select the files. This may just slow down the browsing a bit. And the high resolution drawing option here sets BaseHead to use a increased point count for drawing the waveform on screen. Now, in regards to working with audio, we can also do some basic destructive edits as well. So if we want to clean up some of our recordings, maybe trim the silent bit off the end of a file, or maybe even just crop a portion of the file, we can do that with some simple keystrokes. So if we highlight a section and hit the delete key, this will actually delete that portion of the file. Now, it comes up with this warning here saying that the file has been edited. At the moment, the file hasn't been saved, but when we do save the file, this is a destructive edit. It will actually modify the file itself, and there is no undo for this option, so you have to be pretty sure that this is what you want to do. If we hit Control and S, it will save the file, hit Escape, and it will cancel and revert back to the original. Now, we can also highlight a portion and trim off the start and the end points outside of our selected region. So if we highlight this selection, for instance, and then use Control-Shift-T, this will trim off everything outside of our selected area. And again, we need to use Control-S to save those changes. Now, if we wanted to do some more advanced editing in our external editor, we can set an external editor first up in the Wave Editor options. We can actually set two and choose which editor to send the file to. But once we have a Wave Editor selected, if we click W when we have a file open, that'll open it in the Wave Editor. If we hit Shift and W, that'll open it in the second Wave Editor. Now, if we need to open the file's location, we can press O, and that will open the folder where the file is located. And that pretty much covers the waveform view.